BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
It is a battle between two news magazines, but a battle that says much about our life and times. A tale of Twitter mobs and frightened politicians and no sense, it seems, of calm or moderation. Of allegations as well of entrapment and bullying. It began with an interview given by the conservative philosopher Sir Roger Scruton to the left-wing news magazine The New Statesman. It was promoted by the interviewer George Eaton as a series of outrageous remarks. He tweeted some of them, and Sir Roger, who had an unpaid government job advising on aesthetics in buildings, was sacked. In Parliament he was likened to a white supremacist. But Sir Roger's friends have hit back, publishing in The Spectator an account of the interview that was very different, and coming up with a recording of it. And we don't know whether that recording was stolen or not. The New Statesman had refused to release it, but we've heard it, and you can hear some of it as well in just a moment. I've been talking to Sir Roger, and I started by putting to him what George Eaton, the interviewer, says is a fact. It was not my words that caused his sacking, but his own intemperate comments. True or false?
I would say false. I don't think I spoke intemperately. I speak as I speak. And I discuss things as they're presented to me according to my vision of them. But, obviously the way in which it was presented in the New Statesman was such as to cause some kind of scandal.
At one stage, George Eaton, he tweeted these words that he ascribed to you. Each Chinese person is a kind of replica of the next one, and that is a very frightening thing. Let's listen to the context of that.
There are difficulties round the corner that we are ignoring, like the rise of China. And there's something quite frightening about the Chinese sort of mass politics and the regimentation of the ordinary being. I think that and we invent robots. And they are there. In a sense, they are creating robots out of their own people by so constraining what can be done that each Chinese person is a kind of replica of the next one, and that's a very frightening thing.
Yes.
Maybe I don't know enough about it to be confident in making that judgment, but the politics is like that. And the foreign policy is like that.
And obviously we hear the voice of George Eaton as well in that clip. Now, how do you believe that was misrepresented in the interview as it was presented in the New Statesman?
Well, it was presented as a kind of racist slur on the Chinese people as such. When I was trying to talk about what the communist authorities are trying to do with them, I went on to talk about the concentration camps in which they are trying to eliminate from the Chinese Muslims the God idea and replace it with the party idea. All this is what we all of us know about China, but are for some reason reluctant to say.
But were the words then left out of the interview that would have made plain that context?
Of course. What was left out was the reference to the Communist Party and what the Communist Party is trying to do with the Chinese people. So it made it look as though I was talking about the Chinese people as they are in themselves. It's very obvious that, surely.
So it's perfectly obvious to you, and it is your assertion, that in that case, on the question of China and the Chinese, there was a deliberate attempt made to make you look like a racist when you weren't being one.
Well, I don't want to say that. That makes it look as though I'm accusing George Eaton of something malicious. I'm only saying that something was left out that would have made it impossible to interpret that remark in the way that he does.
Right, so careless rather than malicious.
Yeah, I assume. I don't want this episode to be the ruination of his life as well as mine.
Let's go on to something else that you said, talking now about the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban.
I think power has gone to his head, and he has a huge charisma, and he's made some decisions which are very popular with the Hungarian people, because they were... The Hungarians were extremely alarmed by the sudden invasion of huge tribes of Muslims from the Middle East. And you have to remember that their history is of their relation with Islam is not a happy one.
Again, what from that do you think has been misrepresented?
Well, I would say nothing. I'm telling the truth about what Orban is, the situation he's had to deal with, and the way the Hungarian people, as it were, take this the question of immigration. For them, this is a totally new thing, but there is the historic memory, obviously, of the Ottoman invasions and the occupation of their country, from which they have just about recovered now.
Do you regret the use of the phrase huge tribes of Muslims?
Taken out of context, it's not a very good phrase, and there's an awful lot of my phrases that I regret. I'll probably regret most of the things I'm saying to you now. I'm hoping you will regret some of them, because that's what life is about. It's about trying to get across a point, reaching for the words, not necessarily finding the right ones, but it's only in the whole context that you can actually know what somebody means.
But I suppose it's also about, isn't it, avoiding phrases that you think might dehumanise people. And
yes.
If you use those phrases, that the sense will be among those who hear them and maybe don't know much about you and your background, well, that is something that is effectively racist and damaging to oppressed people.
I don't think that's true of that phrase, and I think, you are now accusing me of something of which you have no right to accuse me, and maybe you will regret using those words at some stage. How can I tell? I have my vision of these things. I'm very interested in the Islamic world, and I'm very pro-Muslim for the most part. But I have to report, when describing what Orban goes through, exactly what the perception of the ordinary Hungarian is of this event. It's not my perception.
There's another part of the interview where you talk about George Soros, the Hungarian-American investor, and you say anybody who doesn't think there is a Soros empire in Hungary has not observed the facts. Now, again, what some people say is that when people talk about George Soros, particularly on the right, that is an anti-Semitic trope.
Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, there are plenty of businessmen all over the world who have empires. If I were George Soros, I'd be really proud of the empire that he has, because it's not just business. He's managed to establish NGOs, a university, all kinds of networks of charitable relief and education and all the rest, which have given him a huge presence in Hungarian society. But nobody who knows the facts would say that this is not an empire. It doesn't follow that it's something bad about it.
And there's another part of the interview where actually you speak very positively about Jewish people in Hungary. Did that make it into the paper, do you know?
No, of course not. I mean, only the negative things got in, as you know very well.
When you were sacked by the government after the interview had taken place, were you asked by anyone in the government for your side of what had happened?
No. I received a phone call. Well, actually, I learned from my secretary when I telephoned home from Paris on my way home that I'd been sacked. I have never received any official communication, nothing at all. I suspect this is all an attempt to flee from the question. I feel very sorry for Mr. Brokenshire, who's obviously suddenly...
He's the minister.
Yes, he was suddenly thrown into the middle of this by the sort of the Twitter storm. I don't do Twitter and all that stuff, so I had no knowledge of what was going on until my poor secretary tremblingly told me. And, then I didn't know what to do. All one can do is sort of lie down and groan for a bit.
But you could have contacted Mr. Brokenshire and said, hang on a second, none of this is true.
I certainly did contact his parliamentary special advisor, of course, but that isn't contacting him. I don't know how to contact him. How do you contact a minister in the middle of the day? I don't know.
What do you think of the way the government treated you?
I'm not very impressed. Let me say what I think about the whole thing. I'm a conservative thinker, well known as such, outspoken but reasonable in my view. And there's been throughout this country and throughout Europe, really, an attempt to silence the conservative voice. We get identified, caricatured, and then demonized and made to look as though we are some kind of sinister, fascist, racist kind of people. And as soon as the Conservative Party sees one of us being demonized in this way, they rush to dissociate themselves from us. This happened, so I gather on social media, all kinds of MPs saying, oh, he's not one of us. And there I am, out in the cold, for my only fault having been trying to defend them. And this, I think, this kind of witch hunting of people on the right is something which is getting worse in our societies. We've just seen it with Jordan Peterson in Cambridge, with Richard Legutko in America. All the people who are absolutely first-rate thinkers and should be in the dialogue so that we have some of their wisdom, but we are being excluded.
But isn't that because the Conservative Party and this government have moved away from you? And if they want to move away from you and modernise themselves, I'm just looking at some of the things that you've said in the past. You've talked about date rape as being no such crime as date rape.
Hang on, this is a slander.
Let me put these things to you, and then absolutely tell me they're wrong. Yeah. That you're quoted as saying that homosexuality has been normalised but not normal. And I suppose the point would be, these are things that you could absolutely hold, views that you could hold as a private citizen. But for a government wanting to be modern, you could understand why, if you hold those views, they might be leery about defending you when you get into trouble.
OK, now you've taken those views, which are snips from BuzzFeed, taken from elaborate arguments that I've made. When I say that there's no such crime as date rape, I'm saying what is true. There isn't a specific legal category of date rape, and I wanted to make that point in order to ensure that people don't use this to obscure the difference between real sexual violence and things that have gone wrong. I feel that it's partly because we're getting our language so vague and slippery at the borders of everything that there's a kind of growing, if you like, distrust between the sexes. There's a growing distrust between people generally because we don't know what we can be accused of. We don't know how to vindicate ourselves when we are accused. That's why I made these remarks about getting the language straight and getting it right. It's then misconstrued by the learned editors of BuzzFeed to attribute to me a thought crime. And this business of constantly manufacturing thought crimes is part of the way that is being used to silence people who are conservative. OK, the Conservative Party wants to run away from those people, but in doing so, it's running away from its own voters. And this is, to me, a gesture of suicide.
Do you have a sense that this is a battle that you can win? I understand it's not a battle you want any part of. You are not involved in Twitter. You don't want to be a representative of a wronged minority. You don't necessarily see yourself in those terms. But is this important enough to you to be something where people do make a stand?
Well, if I'm a representative of something, it's of a wronged majority, not of a wronged minority. But my own interest in this as a philosopher is simply in understanding the world, seeing exactly what is true and what is false in all this farrago, and trying to develop my own conception of human life, how one gets through the world in which it now is, without suffering too much, and in an attitude of tolerance and forgiveness. This is something which is very hard to study how to do, but for me, I do it by reading books, by writing, by reflecting, by listening to music, and talking to my wife.
Do you want your job back?
Well, it would be difficult to get it back, but I think the nation would be better if I got it back, because I was beginning to solve the question. I have a brain, and it's quite a good one, and it was being well used on this particular very difficult question. But I know that there's no point in me trying to do it if it's simply arousing a whole storm of ignorant abuse all the time.
Final thought, we used there a recording that had been supplied by The Spectator. Do you know how that was obtained? Because that was obviously a recording, wasn't it, that was made by George Eaton, by the journalist. How was it got hold of?
Well, actually, I had an email came in to my to my secretary's account with an attachment, and it said that here is an attachment which is of the conversation with George Eaton. I thought that's ridiculous, but I asked my wife to read it, to listen to it. I couldn't bear at the time to listen to anything new about this. And she said, gosh, this is the thing, the actual interview. And then, of course, we put it on a memory stick so that we wouldn't lose it.
So it was an email from a stranger, from someone you didn't know?
Totally anonymous, yeah.
And you don't know how they acquired it?
Of course not.
What would you say to the New Statesman? Because you did ask for the tape in the first place just to be given to you, didn't you?
Well, yes, I said that if I'm going to be to suffer complete destruction of my career and identity and personality as a result of this interview, it would be only decent to let me hear that interview, and they would never release the tape. And so, I mean, in my view, they've been in the wrong from the beginning.
Although George Eaton has apologised, hasn't he, the journalist, for some of the things he tweeted?
Yes.
Though not for the way he conducted the interview.
Yes, he has, of course. And as I say, I don't want this episode, which has all but destroyed me, to destroy him too. I mean, I think he was doing what he thought to be his job, and obviously it's come up against him, but that's a different matter.
What do you want this episode to do?
I want it to clear my name now. I didn't want this episode to exist, but I want my name to be cleared of all these accusations, which have been multiplying. I'm now the great guerrilla of the right, and I want to go back to what I've always been, which is a private person, a philosopher and a writer who sits at home meditating.
Sir Roger Scruton, thank you very much for talking to us.